Somewhere in Russian-held eastern Ukraine, on a stretch of rail line built to carry diesel toward the front, a line of tank cars is burning. Not one car. A whole echelon lit orange against a black July sky, the fire climbing from cistern to cistern while the drone that started it holds its position overhead and watches. The unit that flew it has a name the Russians in the Donetsk direction have learned to fear: K2. And the line they attach to the footage reads almost like a taunt. "The night is dark," they wrote, "but the cisterns burn brightly." That was July 30, 2026. And the brigade behind it did not present the strike as a random success. It presented it as a promise. While Russia hits civilian gas stations in Ukrainian frontline towns, K2 said its operators are working to make sure the occupiers stop seeing fuel at all. Not less fuel. None. That is the campaign this one night belongs to, and to understand why a burning train matters more than a burning tank, you have to understand what fuel actually does in this war. Start with the unit, because the unit is the whole story. K2 is the informal name of the 20th Separate Unmanned Systems Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. It is not a conventional infantry formation that happens to fly a few drones. It is a purpose-built unmanned systems brigade, and it fields the full range of the tool. Short-range quadcopter strike drones for close work. Heavier bomber-type drones that drop munitions from above. Ground robotic platforms that crawl toward Russian positions carrying explosives or supplies. And longer-range strike drones for reaching targets the front line cannot touch. That diversity is the point. Most Ukrainian drone units specialize. K2 built itself to hunt across the whole depth of the Russian rear. And over the past 2 years, it earned a specific reputation in the East for going after the thing most units ignore. Not the tank at the tip of the spear, the supply line feeding it, logistics. The trucks, the depots, the fuel that lets a Russian assault happen at all. So when a Russian fuel echelon lights up in the dark and K2 signs the footage, the attribution is solid. This is exactly the kind of target this brigade was designed to find, and exactly the kind of statement it has made before. The occupiers, the brigade's message ran, will stop seeing fuel. Coming from anyone else, that would be bravado. Coming from K2, it is a description of what they already do for a living. Now the geography, because in this war geography is everything. The Eastern Front runs through Donetsk region in a jagged line that has barely moved in months. Around the Pokrovsk direction, around the approaches that Russia has been grinding at through the spring and summer of 2026, every Russian assault depends on a chain of supply that stretches back hundreds of kilometers into occupied territory and then into Russia itself. Ammunition, spare parts, water, food, and above all diesel. Here is the detail that most people watching this war never think about. A Russian mechanized push does not fail because it runs out of courage. It fails because it runs out of diesel. A T-72B3 main battle tank drinks roughly 240 liters of diesel every 100 kilometers on a road, and far more than that churning across broken ground under load. A BMP-3 fighting vehicle is not much kinder on fuel. Multiply that across a battalion tactical group, add the trucks that carry the shells and the trucks that carry the fuel for the trucks, and a single day of offensive operations consumes fuel by the tens of thousands of liters. That fuel does not appear at the front, it is moved there. And the only way to move it in the volumes a modern army burns is by rail. This is where the rail network becomes a target worth a brigade's full attention. Russia's military logistics were built, from Soviet times, around railways. Wide-gauge track, heavy rolling stock, and long strings of specialized tank cars that carry diesel and petrol in bulk from refineries and storage depots deep inside Russia toward the theater. A single fuel echelon can carry more diesel than 100 road tankers. When it reaches a railhead near the front, the fuel is pumped off, loaded onto Kamaz tanker trucks and driven the last stretch to the forward refueling points where the armor waits. Break the trucks and you slow one day's operations. Break the echelon and you starve the whole railhead. That is the difference K2 is chasing, and it is why the brigade talks about fuel the way an artillery officer talks about counter-battery fire. Cut the artery, and everything downstream of it withers. There is a reason this became a campaign in 2026 and not before. Through the course of the war, both sides learned the same lesson from opposite ends. Ukraine watched Russian offensives stall whenever the fuel chain hiccuped. Russia watched Ukrainian deep strike drones reach further and further into its rear month after month, hitting fuel depots and refineries, and increasingly the trains that connect them. By this summer, striking Russian rail-borne fuel had stopped being a spectacular one-off and become a running effort night after night. Unit after unit, chewing at the logistics that keep the occupation supplied. K2's strike on July 30 belongs inside that wider effort. It is not the first fuel echelon to burn in the east, and it will not be the last. It is one increment in a campaign that has cost Russia a growing tally of rolling stock and fuel across 2026, a campaign whose whole logic is that you do not have to defeat the Russian army in the field if you can keep the diesel from ever reaching the field. Starve the tank and the tank never moves. But there is a problem the brigade faces every single time, and it is worth being honest about it, because it is the constraint that makes this hard. A fuel echelon does not sit still and wait to be found. Consider what the operators are actually up against. A rail line is long and a train on it is moving. It runs at night specifically to avoid being seen. Russian logistics planners are not fools. They learned in 2024 and 2025 that daylight fuel movements near the front were suicide, so the heavy stuff moves in darkness, lights off, on schedules that shift to avoid becoming predictable. The diesel that feeds the Pokrovsk direction is meant to arrive unseen, unload before dawn, and leave the railhead empty by the time the reconnaissance drones are up. That is the Russian assumption. Move it in the dark and the dark will hide it. It is a reasonable assumption. It was true for a long time. It stopped being true the night this echelon burned. To hit a moving fuel train at night, a drone unit needs 3 things to line up at once, and getting all 3 is the hard part. It needs to know where the train is, which means knowing which line is active and roughly when the echelon will be on it. It needs a drone that can see in the dark, because a strike drone with a daytime camera is blind after sunset. And it needs to put the warhead precisely where it matters, because a tank car full of diesel is not a bomb waiting to go off. Diesel is stubborn. It does not detonate like an artillery shell. You have to make it burn. Now, exactly how K2 solved the first of those problems on this particular night is not something the brigade laid out, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The romantic version, the one where analysts pore over intercepted rail schedules and map every siding and predict the echelon to the minute, is the kind of story that sounds good and is almost never confirmed. What can be said is more grounded. Ukrainian units watching the Russian rear have, over months, built up a working picture of how the fuel moves, which corridors run hot, and what a loaded echelon looks like from above. Reconnaissance drones and open-source watchers feed that picture constantly. Somewhere in that picture, on the night of July 30, a fuel echelon put itself where K2 could reach it. That is the honest version of the reconnaissance. Patience, accumulated knowledge, and a target that finally moved into range, not a Hollywood intercept. The second problem, seeing in the dark, is where the technology has quietly changed the war. 2 years ago, night was a shield. A Russian column could move after dark with real confidence that the drones flying above the front carried optics useless in blackness. That confidence is gone. Thermal cameras that read heat instead of light have spread through Ukrainian drone units, and a running diesel locomotive, a train of tank cars warmed by a day in the sun, a railhead full of idling trucks against a cold night landscape, all of it glows. The dark that was supposed to hide the echelon is exactly what makes it stand out. Heat has nowhere to hide when everything around it is cold. The brigade understood the irony well enough to write it into their own message. The night is dark, but the cisterns burn brightly. Read it once and it sounds like a line about fire. Read it twice and it is a line about thermal contrast, about the physics that turned Russia's shield into a spotlight. The first FPV crossed toward the line low and quiet, its operator watching a gray-white heat picture on a screen far away. And here the honest limits of what we know matter again. K2 did not specify the drone type, and it would be a mistake to guess. This is a brigade that flies both nimble quadcopters and heavier bomber drones, and a strike on a fuel echelon could plausibly come from either. So picture it the way the brigade would want it pictured and no further. A K2 strike drone in the dark closing on a line of tank cars that has no idea it has been seen. That was roughly the 5-minute mark of this story, and here is where the arc turns. Everything up to now was preparation, geography, and the physics of heat. What comes next is the part the Russian logistics chain never accounts for, because it's still in 2026. Plans as if the night belongs to the mover and not to the hunter. The echelon on the line believed it was invisible. It had one warning it never received. We will get to what that warning should have been. Fuel is the lifeblood of every Russian push, and the men who move it know it. A Russian logistics officer running a fuel echelon toward the Eastern Front carries a specific kind of pressure. The armor at the tip of the assault is screaming for diesel, and every hour the fuel is late is an hour in offensive stalls. So the echelons run on tight timing and they run at night. And the officers who dispatch them trust the darkness, the way their predecessors trusted it in 1943. The difference is that in 1943, nothing overhead could read the warmth of a fuel car from a kilometer away and steer a warhead into it. There is a bitter symmetry in what K2 said about why they do this. Russia has spent the summer of 2026 striking civilian gas stations in Ukrainian frontline towns, burning the fuel that ordinary people need to evacuate to run generators, to survive a war they did not start. The brigade named that directly. You burn our fuel, the message runs, so we will make sure you stop seeing yours. It is retaliation stated in the plainest possible terms, and it reframes a burning train from a tactical win into an answer. Every gas station Russia torches in Pokrovsk buys another echelon on fire in the Russian rear. Now the strike itself told the way the operators would have lived it. The night is the operator's ally. Somewhere well back from the target, in a position that will never appear on the footage, a K2 crew sits over their screens. One flies. One watches the wider picture. The heat image resolves slowly out of the gray, the long spine of the echelon, the regular spacing of the tank cars, the warmer smear of the locomotive. It is exactly what they were waiting for, and it is exactly where the thermal physics said it would be. Bright against the cold. The approach is the delicate part. A fuel car is a cylinder of steel wrapped around diesel, and diesel does not want to explode. Hit it wrong and you punch a hole and the fuel runs out onto the track, and that is all. Hit it right, put the warhead where the fuel and the air and the ignition meet, and the cylinder becomes a torch. The operator flies the drone in low and level, holding the picture steady, closing the last 100 meters with the target filling the frame. The tank cars do not react. There is no evasive maneuver a train can make. It is bound to its rails, moving on its schedule, blind. Impact. The feed from these strikes always ends the same way. A white bloom that swallows the screen, then the drone gone. Its job done in the instant it stopped existing. But the cameras that mattered on July 30 were the ones that came after. The wider shot. The echelon on the line, one car opened up and burning, and then the fire doing what fire does to a train of fuel. It spreads. Heat off the first car warms the next. A second cistern catches. The orange climbs down the line, car to car, until a stretch of Russian rail is a ribbon of flame in the dark and the smoke stands up black against a black sky. That is the image K2 published, and that is what their line was written under. The night is dark, but the cisterns burn brightly. What the Russian logistics chain never accounts for, the warning it never received, is that darkness stopped being cover the day thermal optics reached the frontline drone units. The echelon ran at night because night was supposed to be safe. Night is where the hunters now do their best work. How much burned, precisely, the brigade did not say, and this is where a careful narrator has to hold the line. Nobody watching this footage can tell you the exact number of tank cars destroyed, or the exact volume of diesel lost, or what happened to the men aboard, and anyone who gives you a confident figure is inventing it. The confirmed core is simple and it is enough. A Russian fuel echelon. A night strike. Tank cars burning brightly enough that K2 built a message around the fire. Whatever the precise tally, that fuel did not reach the front. And that is the number that actually matters, because of what fuel is. Follow the diesel that burned on those rails to where it was going. It was headed for a railhead somewhere behind the Eastern Front, to be pumped into Kamaz tankers and driven forward to a refueling point where armor and infantry fighting vehicles were waiting to be topped off for the next push. A refueling point that received half of what it was promised is not a counterattack. It is a line of thirsty vehicles and a commander explaining to his superiors why the assault that was scheduled for dawn is now scheduled for whenever the next echelon gets through, if it gets through. That is the strategic weight of a single burning train. Not the steel of the tank cars, though those cost money and take months to replace. Not even the diesel itself, priced by the ton. The weight is in the timing. An offensive is a schedule, and a schedule runs on fuel arriving when it is meant to. Break the arrival and you do not just destroy diesel. You destroy a plan. Zoom out and the picture is larger than one night. Across 2026, Ukraine's mid-range drone campaign against Russian rail fuel logistics has become one of the quieter, more consequential efforts of the war. It does not produce the single dramatic frame that a burning airfield produces. It produces something better for a defending army, a steady, grinding tax on the thing every Russian offensive depends on. Fuel trains have burned across the occupied east through the spring and summer, night after night, and each one forces the same adjustments. Move the fuel more slowly. Move it in smaller lots that are harder to catch and less efficient to run. Spend more air defense guarding rail lines that were never meant to need guarding. Every one of those adjustments costs Russia something, and none of them buys back the diesel already gone. This is the part that has to be framed honestly, though, because it cuts both ways. The idea that Ukraine has severed Russia's fuel artery is the brigade's stated intent, and it is a genuine strategic logic, but it is not an independently verified assessment that Russian logistics have collapsed. Russia still moves enormous volumes of fuel. It still mounts offensives. What is true and what is documented across the year's reporting is that the fuel is no longer safe in transit, and safety in transit is the whole premise of a rail-based supply system. An army that has to assume its fuel trains might burn is an army paying a structural price for every liter it moves. K2 did not sever the artery on July 30. It did something more sustainable. It reminded Russia that the artery bleeds. Think about what that means for the Russian side of the ledger, in operational terms rather than human ones. A fuel echelon lost is not just tons of diesel. It is a locomotive and a string of specialized tank cars that Russia's railways cannot easily spare, taken out of a rotation that was already stretched. It is a railhead that stays hungry for another day. It is air defense assets pulled off the front to cover rail corridors, which means fewer of them covering the assault columns, which means the next Ukrainian strike deeper in the rear has a slightly easier path. Each burning train tightens the same knot. That is why a brigade like K2 treats logistics as a first-class target, and not an afterthought. The men who ran that echelon chose their war. The Kontraktnik logistics soldiers who move fuel toward the Ukrainian front are not conscripts swept up by accident. They signed contracts, took the pay, and crossed a border that was not theirs to cross to keep an invasion supplied. On July 30, one echelon's worth of them discovered that the border they crossed has a way of holding the line even 100 kilometers into the dark. The train that was supposed to feed the next assault fed a fire instead. Come back to the message the brigade attached to it all, because it closes the loop that opened this story. The night is dark, but the cisterns burn brightly. It reads like poetry and it functions like doctrine. The darkness that protected Russian fuel movements for the first years of the war is now the medium in which Ukrainian drone crews hunt best, because heat betrays what light once hid. And the promise underneath it, that the occupiers will stop seeing fuel, is not a boast about one train. It is a description of a campaign that intends to make every echelon a gamble. Russia moves fuel to the Eastern Front because it must. Every tank that pushes toward Pokrovsk, every fighting vehicle that grinds at the Donetsk line, runs on diesel that started its journey on rails deep in occupied territory. K2 has decided to meet that fuel before it ever reaches the front in the dark, where the physics now favor the hunter. The cisterns that burned on July 30 will be replaced, so will the next ones. And the brigade that flew that drone will be watching the rails again the following night, because the whole logic of this fight is that you do not have to stop the Russian army if you can keep it from ever filling its tanks. The night is dark. The cisterns burn brightly. And somewhere in the Russian rear, the next fuel echelon is already rolling toward a front line where the darkness no longer belongs to it.